Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm chatting with Sylvia Sabes, a journalist and author based in France. She's here to discuss a word that epitomizes French romanticism. Or does it? Aimer. Welcome to you, Sylvia. Sylvia, can you tell us a little bit about what brought you here to France and what you're doing here now?
I was 9 years old when I decided that I was going to live in France someday. And that was inspired by a book my mother read to me about this horrible story of this poor orphan boy that everyone treated very poorly. And somehow I identified with that story and thought that's the people I want to be with. So that's how I ended up in France. And I've been here for about almost 20 years now.
Wow. And I know that you are a journalist. You frequently write for the BBC. Can you tell me a little bit about your path that led you there? What do you like to write about? And how do you find the topics that you want to explore?
So I was a creative director in advertising. And when I moved here, it was hard to get a network. So I started doing advertising copywriting and really found that it's just another way of storytelling without the images. And I loved it. And I started writing more and more about France and life in Paris, at first just for friends and family. And then a farm magazine contacted me, and I'm still one of their Paris experts. And I write the Luxe City Guide on Paris for them. And then, as you mentioned, the BBC and online magazines. I get inspiration from my everyday life. I live with a Frenchman. I'm raising children in France, and just how things are different but the same, and being constantly aware of all the details of our daily life fascinates me, and I really appreciate it.
So I guess part of your life has probably inspired your in-depth knowledge of the word that we're going to be discussing today, which is aimer. Aimer, which is often translated as to like, but also sometimes means to love. And the French do have two distinct words. They have aimer and adorer, which is a cognate of adore in English. But those translations aren't really apt. It's not the same sort of division between like and love as we have in English. So how would you compare the difference between aimer and adorer and the difference in English between like and love?
Well, for aimer and adorer, that was a question I had myself because I wasn't sure which was stronger. And so when I started doing research for an article on this question on why French people don't say je t'aime very often, I asked everybody I knew which was stronger and why. And down the line, all the French people, without hesitation, they said aimer is stronger. It refers to a much stronger attachment and it's more intimate. And adorer is more casual. But when I spoke to Anglophones, they were a lot less sure. And those who felt pretty confident actually felt adorer indicated a stronger attachment because they hear it less often, I think. So aimer is still, although we use it for ice cream and fabrics, it still really refers to love as well, a very strong, intimate attachment that adorer does not indicate. That's what the people I spoke to, everyone I interviewed, indicated. And in English, we don't really use adore very often anymore. It's kind of gone out of fashion. But on the other hand, we use love so much that it's almost hard to know what it means anymore. One of the people I interviewed was a French girl who had gone to a bilingual school in Paris, and she and her friends had invented another word for love so that when they said it to each other, they knew it was being said with intent. Whereas we say it as a reflex. I never get off the phone with any of my family members without saying love ya. I don't even go to the bother of saying you completely. It's just almost a greeting, an official greeting, where we don't think of what we're really saying anymore.
Yeah, and it almost feels on par with the rest of this very American enthusiasm, like every friend is your best friend. Oh, my best friend said this, and it's like you have 15 best friends. Or like, oh my God, I absolutely love this dish, this bread, this croissant, when you're not even really thinking about what the depth of that word really means.
Yeah, or, Americans, they want the best roast coffee to the point where now it's becoming popular to go and roast your own. And the French, they're not so sure that there's a best. The best tarte au citron is the best one for the moment. It might be the one that reminds you of the tarte au citron your grandmother made, or it might be one from a new chef that has interesting flavors never tasted before. And it'll vary depending on your mood and what you want at that time. Whereas in the American culture, it's more of the idea to have the ultimate best, better than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mystery to French how enthusiastic we can be.
No, I mean, we're loud, we're enthusiastic, we like everything. And I actually remember when I first moved here, I noticed how hypercritical the French can be. And this is probably like a whole other conversation, but I do feel like, if someone takes the time to suggest a restaurant that you all go to, for example, and this is a French person, and as an American, you get invited and you like it, fine. You're always going to find something nice to say about it. Whereas I feel like the French might be a little bit more realistic, but it can sound really negative when you first move here and you don't know that they're not just this like knee-jerk enthusiasm of liking things or loving things just isn't really that pervasive in the French culture.
Yeah, well, we were talking about this the other day. I have a niece visiting from the US. She's 16, and we're explaining that to pass the baccalaureate exam, if you get a 16, that's considered an extraordinary note. 16 out of 20, which is 80%. That's not that's a good note, but it's not such an exciting note in America. In America, kids are expected to get 21 out of 20. There's always ways to get bonus points with AP classes. That doesn't exist here. So it's really young, this lack of exaggeration or enthusiasm, as you say. And there's a French comedian named Alex Lutz who's very popular, and he does a stand-up routine in theaters. And one of the skits is all about Americans and how we're always saying, it's amazing. And he says that, and the whole room explodes in laughter because they can all identify with how strange it is and how they feel so unsure of what's going on when Americans are constantly saying amazing.
And so we have this deep enthusiasm and this intense blanket liking of everything. And one thing that you explored in this article that you wrote about aimer is that the French really don't say I love you that often. So why do you think that is?
One of the things that I learned while writing different articles in my research is that the French are a lot less likely to say what they are and more likely to say what they are not. So, Americans, as we do get enthusiastic, we go into exaggeration. And on a warm summer day, we'll say, I'm melting, it's so hot, it's boiling. And the French will say, ugh, it's not cold out today. So they're more of a tendency in general to say what they're not. And so it's less natural for them to say, I love you, I'm in love with you. And they're just more likely to show it.
Is that true only in romantic relationships, do you feel? Or do you think that, like, for example, what you were saying earlier about every time you get off the phone with your family saying, I love you, do you think that it's the same kind of thing in sibling relationships or like parent-child relationships?
Definitely. Grandparents are the only ones who I spoke to who said, oh, I say it sometimes to my grandkids. But across the board, when you're walking around Paris, you hear it less. I was just in the US visiting my family for the first time in 2 years. And since I just written this article, I was more aware of it. And I was hearing the word love all the time. People getting in the car, people on the phone, people saying hello. And they were always saying, love you, love you, love you. And it was constant on the street. And here you just don't hear it like you do in the US. And it's hard because when I first said I was going to do this article, my French family was very nervous, saying that might just be us. And after this article has come out, I've gotten contacted by so many expat women married to Frenchmen who are so relieved and saying, oh, thank God it's not my marriage. This was something that was so hard for me, so frustrating for me. And now I understand that it's just part of the culture here. And then I had a few other women who would say to me, actually, my husband says I love you all the time. And we talk a little more. And the Frenchman is saying I love you in English. He's not saying je t'aime. He's saying I love you.
Mm.
Easier for them to say it in English. It doesn't feel awkward or uncomfortable. So that was a workaround that's happening. A lot of the couples that contacted me after this article came out.
And I think that must be like a big surprise to Americans because the French are portrayed in the media as being so romantic. And I think you kind of gave a hint to this when we were talking earlier about this discrepancy of the French don't say I love you very often, but they are romantic. Or aren't they? Or is that a total stereotype and a cliche? What do you think?
In my life, there's a lot of romance. And I don't think it's a total cliche when you look at the restaurants and how, even if it's with just you and a girlfriend, it's this concentrated time. It's not a quick 45-minute meal shoving food down your throat. Now in San Francisco, you have your table for 90 minutes and then you have to leave. Whereas here, it's a ceremony. And even in elementary school, they have the starter and the main dish and the dessert. And it's all the theater and the decorum around these events that, for me, contribute to romanticism. I talked about at the beginning of this interview this book that my mother read to me about this orphan boy, and it's called Sans Famille. It's a French classic. My mother read it to me in English, where it's the US, it's called Nobody's Boy by Hector Mello. And it's the story of this orphan boy who's taken on by a musician. And the musician, in the end, he gives his life so that this boy can find his family. It's not a romantic love, but it's still, I mean, it's not a physical love, but it's still an incredibly romantic gesture of this man doing everything so this boy can be in a home and a family. And French culture has that all around it all the time. We have the history of Héloïse and Abélard, who were great lovers in the Middle Ages. And there's still a plaque to them on the Ile de la Cité in Paris because they're an intrinsic part of French culture in a way that warriors and cowboys and Indians are in American culture.
Wow. Okay. So you have, like you said, kind of this showing of love through actions rather than simply through the fact of saying, I love you or je t'aime.
Yes. So Héloïse and Abélard, she was the daughter of a curate and he was a tutor. And they eloped and married and she got pregnant. And he was actually castrated for having done this by her uncle. And they remained this romantic relationship after it that spanned their entire lifetimes. And it was definitely platonic because there's no way for it to be anything else. And that is the great French ideal. It's this gesture of ultimate love, sacrificing everything. And it's the luxury industry is a material incarnation of that with all these extravagant gifts that can be given. And again, the 3-star restaurant dining and even the movie theaters with the 2 seats sitting together now. And just so much is set up for things to be romantic without having to say, I love you. In Paris right now, there's a florist. I think within 10 minutes of my house, there might be at least 10 florists. I'm thinking off the top of my head, within a 10-minute walk of my house. There's florists everywhere. And the pastries.
Yeah, so lots of opportunities to show how you feel.
Yeah, all the time.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. One sort of thing that gave me pause, because I was reading this article that you wrote, and I've had really different experiences in my relationships with French men. And I think that one thing I've noticed and I've kind of heard across the board is that while maybe they don't say it as often, French people do seem to say, I love you a lot earlier in relationships than Americans do. You know, you hear of American women, maybe this is less the case now as we're getting older, but American young women in relationships sort of waiting for their boyfriends to say, I love you, and they're waiting months and months and months. Whereas in relationships with a French man, it almost feels like it can come too soon or before they even really know you that well. First of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, do you have any idea of why they might be saying it so early as compared to Americans?
I do agree with it wholeheartedly. And I spoke to a lot of women who agree with it on both sides, French and American women. And the French women kind of scoffed at me saying, what's the big deal? And I think that that's the key, that for them, I love you in a relationship. It's not considered a big stage. It doesn't have the same weight. It is more like saying I'm hot or I'm cold. I love you. I'm not into you right now. They don't consider a stage in a relationship. It's not a milestone. The first time he said, I love you. The milestone for them is when they decide to move in together. And until then, they're just dating. And it seems like, and I think you'll agree that you meet and then you're dating. There's not very much of a bridge
Yep.
in between the two. And then the dating can last a while and then you're living together or you're not, or it's over. But yeah, it's very quickly that it's dating and it's all in and it's expected to be monogamous at that point, very quickly.
Yeah, I was gonna say like it's dating, but it's even more that it's like en couple, in a couple, en couple,
Yeah.
because it's like in the States you can be dating multiple people at the same time. But in France, once you've like kissed one person, the expectation is that that's the only person that you're making out with until you hear otherwise.
Yeah. On the other hand, I do have friends who have been in those kinds of relationships only to find out the man was married or living with another woman who
Ah,
had no
yes.
idea something else was going on. So that there is that the other side of it, I'd say. But definitely, the woman thinks that they're in a monogamous relationship, or one person. It's not always a woman, to be fair, but one party will think that they're in this monogamous relationship because of how obsessive and how much time is consuming it is.
Yeah, and like you meet the parents faster, you meet their childhood friends more quickly. It goes very fast from like we met and we like each other to now we're exclusive and now you're part of my life.
Yes, yes, especially with the friends, and they do tend to have these circles of childhood friends. Are they move around a lot less? They don't go as far for university, especially the Parisians. So they have these circles of very close friends, and they do meet the girlfriend or boyfriend very quickly.
So here in Paris, we have this tourist attraction up in Montmartre. It's a wall covered with the words I love you in every language around the world. And it's a massive tourist destination. But given how the French feel about this phrase, do you get any sense of how they feel about that being such a huge attraction in Paris?
It's funny. I have a friend who lives right across the street, just behind that. There's a Neo-Byzantine church covered in brick, and she lives kind of down behind that church. And she didn't even know the wall existed um, until I talked to her about it, and I had to research it for these guidebooks that I write. And I went there to photograph it for an article I was writing about romance in Paris. And I sat on the bench, and I didn't hear any French when I was there at all. I probably spent just one morning there, but nobody who was coming there was French. And I don't think even my children, who are adults now, they've ever heard of it. They grew up in Paris. They've never heard of it, I don't think. It's just not something French people are really even aware of. So I don't think they have a thought of it because I don't think they know, very many know it's there. They're very proud of living in the city of love. And that is a really good example of how it's about the gestures and not the words, because I've been at least three different men driving through the Carrousel du Louvre at night when you have IMPs, pyramid is all lit up, and you can see the Arc de Triomphe in the background, and they just, their breath is taken away by the beauty of it, and they stop for a moment, even when they're driving, just to mention and notice the beauty of it. And that, and for me, is incredibly romantic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look at this beautiful moment we're sharing, and that is not uncommon for Parisians to take a moment and notice the beauty that's around them. Instead of having to go to a specific wall, they've got it everywhere. And it might be the carvings of a door, it might be a pastry, but that they are often aware of all the great things around them and taking a moment to share that with the person they're with, which is lovely.
Yeah. And when we take for just a second that word aimer out of the context of romantic love and we use it as a way of sort of like discerning that something is good, do you think that in inserting themselves into liking something, the French are actually kind of, how am I going to put this? I feel like the French often feel like they don't need to say that it's their opinion because they trust their opinion so implicitly that it becomes almost objective. Like that's the way they converse with people. So when they say, I liked this restaurant or I liked this pastry, like I think instinctively I would say that they'd be more likely to say, this was good or this was great and not say, I liked it, like not insert themselves into the judgment of a specific thing. Do you think that, does that resonate for you, or do you feel like?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that a lot of things are a lot less in the relationship to themselves and more in just an outside critique of a pastry or a flower, a bouquet. And they often will describe it. They'll say, you should try this pastry because, and they can say why that pastry is really good, or going on vacation to this destination versus that destination and why they go to those places. Where I live, it's the surf capital of France, and I've never heard anyone really say I like surfing or I love surfing. They say I am a surfer, or I don't surf, I golf. It's less about defining the object as well, which is the opposite of what I just said. But yeah, I like, you should golf. It's great. It's a great way to see the country because you go from one golf course to another visiting the country. That's something somebody has said to me.
So they almost don't have a use for the word. They express it in different ways, whether it's in a romantic relationship or just regarding something that they have strong feelings about.
Well, I did, when I was doing a little bit of research for our conversation, I looked up the synonyms for like and the synonyms for aimer. And we like it or we don't like it. Sometimes we might say, j'adore, I adore that, but not really. We don't really say that. It's just like or love. We're more likely to love something. Whereas the French, they do say j'aime ça, j'aime pas, or they say j'adore, and then like, ah, j'adore ta robe. They get very enthusiastic about it. And they also kiffe. They have a slang word that they kiffe your new flat, or they kiffe chocolate cake. And that's a slang way of saying they like something or somebody. And so they actually have more ways of saying it than we do that are likely to be heard on the street today. If you go compare the two lists of synonyms, there are a lot of them, but they're not words that we use very often in either culture.
Yeah, keef is definitely a frequent one. Do you know by chance where that comes from? Like what the etymology of it is?
I know it's Verlan.
Yeah, I'm looking it up. So it comes from Arabic, which a lot of slang does. And so it means fun. The word keef in Arabic is fun, or also how. Huh. Okay. Well, it means fun.
Oh, because it comes to the feeling of, actually came from smoking marijuana, the pleasure associated with smoking marijuana. That's
Excellent.
that's where it came from. Hash or marijuana.
Okay. Well, there we
So,
go.
but that is something, and they keep one another too, especially the younger under 20s, well, probably under 30s. They keep je kiffe ce mec, that you'll hear all the time. But it's more of a crush kind of like, and not so much of a love. And it can just be a friendship kind of feeling.
Yeah, or like an appreciation. Like I've heard that a lot for like something where you'd say like, "Oh my god, this dude is awesome." You'd be like, "Oh, je kiffe ce mec," like he's done something crazy, or like not necessarily romantic, just appreciating someone for who they are.
Yeah, or they have an awesome TikTok account.
Also that TikTok is important.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that is a pretty young age group.
Yeah. We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Well, Sylvia, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about aimer. I've got one more question for you before we go, and that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Ooh, écureuil.
Oh, that's a good one.
It's so hard to say.
Écureuil.
No, écureuil, squirrel.
Oh, écureuil. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah,
I thought you said the one that makes you seasick, but écureuil squirrel, yeah, that's a tough one to say.
Yeah, it's a tough one to say, but I love it. Écureuil.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where can folks find you on the internet? Twitter, Instagram, where are you?
I'm at Sylvia Sabes on Twitter and on Instagram more than anywhere else. I also have a website, sylviasabes.com with my articles on Paris if you want to read more about Paris and France from my point of view.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.